Today we're really excited to have Terry Chapin here. Terry is a distinguished professor emeritus of ecology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's been there for quite some time. He's also spent some time at Berkeley and the faculty there. He is a pillar in the field. He's written 12 books, including a couple of textbooks that are widely used, written over 400 journal articles and book chapters. So very prolific, very influential researcher in ecology. One of the someone who's really been at the forefront of trying to incorporate social sciences and natural sciences in collaborative research. He's had a very illustrious career. He's won more awards than I want to spend the time to take, but he's been named as a AAAS Fellow, as a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He was apparently the first distinguished professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks. That's impressive. The first person to be named that. And I was like to note that he was voted the outstanding faculty member at University of Alaska Fairbanks by the students there. He's served on various working groups for the National Academy of Sciences, the IPCC, the National Climate Assessment Advisory Committee, and the National Research Council. He's been directed an IGERT on resilience and adaptation, as well as an LTER. So for those of you who know those acronyms, those are very impressive things to have been involved in. Served on numerous editorial boards and advisory boards for different research organizations. I could go on for a lot longer, but I don't think you want me to. So I will turn it over to Terry. Welcome. We're very excited to have you. Thank you.
Well, I'm really happy to have an opportunity to be here. One of the things that characterizes Alaska now is that things are changing fast. And I suspect that you could say the same thing about Montana, or probably just about any place in the world. We're in a world of change, and the details may be different, but I think a lot of the issues that we face are really similar. And so that's what I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about Alaska because that's what I know about. But I'd like you to be thinking about whether any of this is relevant to Montana or places that you care about. I think that Alaska really is a microcosm of things that are happening globally, just as Montana is a microcosm of things that are happening in other places. We have an issue of changes in fossil fuel extraction. We have statewide budget crises. We have climate warming. What I'd like to do is tell you something about these and then talk about the ecological and societal consequences of these. And particularly focusing on how we can look for solutions rather than just talking about the problem, and how we can shape the conversation so that we can have a more cohesive and meaningful conversation among different members of society as we do this. Just thinking about oil production, 90% of the revenue in Alaska has come from oil production for the last 30 years or more. This is changing to be just about no revenue coming from oil production in the next year or two. We've gone from a time of budget surpluses to a time of very large budget deficits. The revenues for the state are less than half this year of what they were last year. And all of these changes propagate down to everything that the legislature chooses to spend money on. But in the bigger picture, Alaska really isn't all that important. It only accounts for 3% of the oil consumption in the United States. Production's declining. The price of oil is declining. But on the other side of the coin, there's been a strong push for developing renewable energy, because in rural Alaska, people get most of their energy for electricity and heating from diesel fuel, which has to be generally flown into these communities, so it's expensive. They're about 3.5 times more expensive in these rural communities than they are in most of the United States. But Alaska has good sources of renewable energy, so there's interest in trying to develop renewable energy, even though the state economy has been so dependent on fossil fuels. Many of you have probably seen this graph of global temperature and the changes since the instrumental record began in 1880 and could be generalized to the global scale. And you can see that temperatures have warmed over that time period, although not consistently so. If you look at the map, you can see that the high latitudes are the places where warming is occurring most rapidly, and Alaska's a good example of that. Our temperatures have increased at about twice as fast as the global average. And here you can see the maps, a graph of temperature in Alaska from various different models. You can see the historical trend here, and over the last 40 years there's been a clear increase in temperature, and all of the models agree that this is likely to continue because the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere is going to account for the changes in temperature over the next several decades. And so, but what does this really mean to an organism or to us? If you think about here at the end of the century, you can see that the coldest temperatures projected at the end of the century are very similar to the warmest temperatures that we've had historically. Now, each of you knows what a cold year is like, and each of you knows what a warm year is like. So think about the warmest year that you can remember. That's likely to be the coldest year at some time in the future. As I say, Alaska's warming more rapidly than other places, so it may not occur quite so rapidly in Montana as in Alaska. But these are the kinds of magnitudes of changes that we have seen and are likely to see in Alaska. And of course, there's some very logical consequences of this. It means that sea ice has been melting, and the areal extent of sea ice is much less now than it was at the beginning of the satellite record. The areal extent of sea ice is declining. It's the models that perform most, there's a lot of disagreement among models as to how quickly sea ice will disappear, but those models that have been most successful in reconstructing the historical record suggest that it might be about 2040 when the Arctic becomes ice-free at the end of the summer season. That's a huge change. It's a very different world, and this has consequences. For marine mammals, it means a very different environment in which they live. Walruses typically get on ice floes, the females and calves get on ice floes, and then float northward as the current takes them northward, and use this as a nursing and feeding platform, and basically move across their dinner table over the course of the summer. Now these ice floes have melted, so they have to move ashore and use the shore as the place where they rest and feed during the summertime. That's a very different ecology. It's a totally different ecology for that animal. It's unlikely that walrus will go extinct because of this, but they're going to have a very different ecology than they've had historically. And the people who depend on them for as the source of food are faced with a very different set of issues than they were historically. It's much less safe to travel on ice than it used to be because it's thinner and it breaks apart more easily. But there's opportunities associated with this also. There's all sorts of opportunities for travel across the Arctic Ocean rather than going all the way around South America or Africa in order to get between Asia and Europe. So very major changes is the main message, I guess. Another thing that happens when the sea ice melts is that in November, when the big fall storms come out of the Bering Sea, they're not going across an ice-covered surface that stabilizes the water surface, but they're creating waves that build up energy, and so when they hit the west coast of Alaska, there's a tremendous amount of erosion that threatens local communities. Most of the glaciers in Alaska are receding, and this puts a fair amount of water into the ocean, enough to be globally significant in terms of sea level rise. Permafrost is something that is unique to Alaska within the United States, almost. And in the blue colors, you can, on the left, you can see a map of permafrost, the current state of permafrost. The projections in the center for mid-century and end of century on the right. The upper is a high emission scenario of changes in air temperature. The lower row is a more optimistic scenario of changes in temperature. And in either case, you can see that by the end of the century, what has been a permafrost-dominated interior of Alaska is going to be largely permafrost-free. This means that the hydrology of interior Alaska is going to be changed from a hard-bottomed hydrology to one where groundwater flow, where there's a lot more flow to groundwater from surface waters. One of the consequences of this is that many lakes are, it's like pulling the stopper out of the bathtub, they drain. Or because of warmer temperatures during the summer, we have more evaporation. So the surfaces in Alaska have become much drier. This has a lot of implications for migratory waterfowl as well as for local people. There's more wildfires, twice as extensive as they used to be a couple of decades ago. More insect outbreaks. All of the tree species in interior Alaska, except one, are hit with major insect infestations that they didn't have a couple of decades ago. When the permafrost thaws, the permafrost has many areas of just solid ice. And when that solid ice melts, then the permafrost, the soil collapses and it looks more like this. So you go from this kind of soil level to this sort of a soil level. Any sort of roads or buildings that are built on top of that have problems as you go through this permafrost thaw. The permafrost also has twice as much carbon globally as the atmosphere does. So if that permafrost thaws and becomes and can potentially lead to decomposition that would not have happened otherwise. As I just mentioned, there's infrastructure problems when the permafrost thaws. Now we know a lot about what's happened with climate. Climate assessments began in earnest about 25 years ago at an international level. And since then we've had climate assessments approximately every 4 years, and we now know in a lot more detail what's happening to climate. But the basic understanding, the bottom line picture, is the same as it was a quarter century ago. The climate is warming, the climate's likely to continue to warm, and this is going to play out in different ways in different places. At the national level, assessments began in 2000. Same story. The story 2 years ago when the climate assessment was most recent national assessment was published is basically the same story as in the first assessment. In Alaska, the first assessment was in 2007. So at all of these scales, we know that climate warming is occurring. We know that climate is changing in different ways in different places. And we're improving our understanding of the details of these processes. But the bottom line story of the nature of climate change is continuing. It has remained more or less the same. And it's increasingly obvious that it's not going away. And so if climate change has societal consequences, has ecological consequences, the need for action is increasingly obvious. Alaska began a climate change adaptation planning process in 2007 with a report that happened 2 years later. This report was released to state agencies. By the time it was released, a new governor was in place. The governor decided that climate change was not part of his agenda, and there's been no response to the climate recommendations that were provided. Basically, nothing has happened in terms of government uptake of that response at the state level. In terms of implementation, there has been some really excellent programs, state programs that have been done with a few of those communities that are facing serious erosion issues. But other than that, not much has happened. So this, I think, is a common situation that the science provides the information that may be needed to make decisions about climate change, but that government at the highest levels is not taking action on this. And so I think there's opportunities for action to be taken at other levels. And this provides opportunities for each of us here in the room. Another thing that concerns me in Alaska is that climate change most strongly affects Native communities, because these are the people who are most dependent on hunting, fishing, and navigating their local landscape in order to lead their lives. And there's many of these changes that influence rural people. The thinner ice makes travel more dangerous. Snow machines go through the ice every year. There's changes in the distribution and ecology of key subsistence species, including salmon, caribou, moose. Coastal erosion destroys infrastructure and threatens lives, as I mentioned before. There's health concerns from the thawing of permafrost as ice cellars no longer keep food frozen, and as water and sewage systems break up as a result of uneven subsidence of the ground. But on the other hand, there's a deep historical cultural history of coping with the local environment, with adjusting to the local environment. Some of my friends who live in the villages tell me, if climate change gets serious, it's you folks in the cities that I'm worried about. We deal with these kinds of changes every year. It's always changing. We know how to cope. It's you folks in the cities that are going to have problems. And often I think he's right. Also, in rural communities, climate change is just one small piece of a bigger picture. There's rising costs and less money to deal with rural issues in Alaska as a result of declines in federal funding, declines in state spending. There's changes in the harvest of wild foods and health, issues of travel safety. There's integration of climate change with other issues that communities are concerned about, renewable energy and other things. So it's really all parts of one big package. It's not just a climate change issue. And so when we think about opportunities to adapt to climate change, I think it's useful to think of it in that larger context that that individuals, families, and communities are facing. So I'd like to tell you about this community partnership for SelfReliance, which is a small group that we started in Alaska. And the goal of this partnership with communities and the universities is to foster self-reliance in the face of declining federal and state support programs for rural communities and in the face of high fuel costs. So the goal here is to develop research partnerships between communities and the university, which are led by community members, led by community goals and community visions for what they need to sustain their communities over the long term. And then identifying research groups in the universities that have expertise that communities want and that are willing to work with communities on these issues. In a sense, it's a social experiment in turning the relationship of research and communities on its head so that communities are guiding the process and so that communities decide what the goals decide what self-reliance means and how to get there. This means that every community that we work with is going to have slightly different goals, slightly different process. So it's a wonderful way to do an experiment about how to solve problems, because there's no monolithic government to tell you how to do it. Each community is going to do it differently. These are the 4 communities that we've been working with. 2 are interior Alaskan communities, Athabascan Indian, and 2 are Yupik Eskimo communities on the coast. Most rural communities in Alaska are isolated. There's no roads most of these communities are not on the road system. They're not on the electricity grid. There's very few jobs available. It's the most extensive area of poverty in the United States, and yet they have the highest cost of commercial goods anywhere in the United States. So they're facing a major economic crunch. But people choose to live there because they want to live there, not because they're stuck there, because they really appreciate the connections that they have to the land and waters around them. They get about 30 to 40% of the calories from hunting and fishing, so it's an important part of livelihoods as well as an important part of local culture. Here's a picture of the community. Here's the airstrip in the village of Igiugig, which is one of the communities where we work, and this gives you a sense for the remoteness of that community. This is some of the erosion issues that's faced by Newtok, another one of the communities that we work with. They've lost probably 200 or 300 feet to erosion on the coastal side of this community. Now the closest houses are within 10, 20 feet, and the largest building in the village, which is both a school and an emergency evacuation center, is likely to get eroded away within the next 2 decades. There's a huge increase in respiratory ailments because the sewer system doesn't work and there's no safe water anymore. There's real issues for this community, and they are trying to relocate to a new place. And they've done some just amazing things on their own initiative to make that possible. I have incredible respect for the capacity of this community to solve their own problems. They're just amazing. I've learned so much from them. Permafrost is thawing within the village, so that the boardwalks that they use to get from place to place are often underwater. Storm surges go through and give them problems. So across these 4 communities, what each community told us after visiting the community 3 times and beginning a conversation in which they led the conversation and we listened, it was really clear from each of them that their long-term goals for self-reliance, at the core of this was cultural integrity and maintaining a strong culture. That's why they live where they do. And that guided all their decisions about other priorities. Other priorities that very quickly came to the surface were things such as renewable energy to reduce the cost of heating and electricity. More energy efficient housing, again, to reduce the costs of living in an isolated place. And the other general category of issues that they were particularly concerned about in each of these communities was increasing difficulty in meeting their subsistence needs, although the reasons for that differed from one community to another. In addition, each community had unique concerns that they needed to deal with that were different from those concerns in other villages, and that for which there was no state agency that had a generalized solutions to provide. Village relocation in Newtok, protecting infrastructure from flooding in Kayakuk by building it up above flood levels, securing legal rights to clean water in Igiugig in the threat of a mine upstream, rights to fish for salmon in Nikolai when the state agencies were shutting down the salmon fishery to protect threatened stocks. So we had community meetings. The communities decided when and how we would meet. Elders were a really important part of the process because they're the history books. They're the memory, a large part of the memory of what's worked and what hasn't in these communities. And they were really important in guiding the conversations that happened. This is the community of Newtok. Every time I went there, kids were doing their traditional dances. They were doing them in the gym after school, or they were doing them in the classrooms to prepare for some dance competition with other villages. But you could see that this was a real part of their culture. I was really impressed at the extent to which their cultures were alive and well and were really an active part of what people were doing at all ages. So this is my current passion right now in terms of Alaska, but it's part of a broader strategy that I've been interested in, the notion of stewardship, which is the active shaping of pathways of change in social ecological systems for the benefit of both human society and for the health of ecosystems. And so the key features of this as a management strategy in my mind are, first of all, that it involves active intervention rather than patching up problems after they begin to occur. It involves shaping changes rather than just resisting them. It's a system where you recognize that people are part of nature rather than working against nature. And there's two goals that, in my mind, are equally important: societal benefits and well-being, and ecosystem health and integrity. And unless you can address both of those together, the solutions are not going to work over the long term, in my mind. So my general strategy for stewardship is sort of a multi-tier strategy. First, you try to reduce the rates of preventable changes that are causing problems and causing stresses. Think about the unnecessary consumption that goes on in the United States, which drives fossil fuel emissions. But there's some things that are happening that we can't totally stop. Climate change is on its way. The carbon that's in the atmosphere is going to drive climate change for another 30 to 50 years. So we need to adapt and shape changes to those external pressures that can't be totally prevented. We need to prepare to live in a warmer climate. We need to manage wildfires in a situation that's going to be different in the future than what it was in the past. And finally, we need to think about how to avoid and escape from those traps that we've gotten sucked into that are putting society into a bad place. One example of those is development that's occurring in fire-prone landscapes. There's several approaches to motivating stewardship. One approach is through regulations that constrain unsustainable behavior. Another approach is through documenting the value of the ecosystem services, of the benefits that society receives from ecosystems through valuation of ecosystem services. And this is really important because it aligns lets you put the information out that enables you to align economic incentives with the benefits that society receives. But I think a lot of people do the right thing by the environment, not because of economic incentives, not because of fear of regulation, but because they really care about their relationship to the environment and what the environment means to them. So I think the opportunities for sense of place as a motivation for stewardship are really strong, but we haven't really exploited those as a way to think about how to advance the magnitude of environmental citizenship. Excuse me a second. But sense of place is complicated. It partly depends on the nature of the place. It partly depends on the history that people have in that place, the stories, the memories, the cultural connections to place. It depends on the political and the economic contexts of place. And it depends on both the real characteristics of those places and those aspects of those places that are imagined. So, and sense of place doesn't always foster stewardship. Think about gated communities, or think about the tensions that arise in logging communities, where loggers and conservation-minded people both care about the forests that are there, but they have a different vision of how those forests can benefit society. Both of those are valuable visions, and so you need to think about how to negotiate these tensions that arise as you begin to explore a sense of place. And I think my approach would be to understand what really motivates people's connection to place. And often they're different, the true motivations may be different than what people say on the surface. And then draw on those aspects of sense of place that unite people and make people care about the same place. And then think about how to negotiate an acceptable compromise on those points with which you disagree. And there's lots of ways to deal with compromise that there's not time to go into here. I just want to give one example of a situation where sense of place was important in Fiordlands in western New Zealand. This was a place where it's an incredibly beautiful area. It was one of the last places in New Zealand to get developed for anything because it was the most remote. But nonetheless, fishery stocks were sequentially depleted from about 1850 onwards. But the real wake-up call came in about 1950 when the cruise industry relocated from the Middle East to New Zealand because of political danger and disruption in the Middle East. And when a road was built from interior of New Zealand down to the fjords so that sports fishermen and other people had easy access to the place. And all of the people that used the Fiordlands for various different reasons could see that change was coming. They could see that it wasn't going to stay the way they remembered it. And so they agreed that they would come together and come up with a solution that would sustain this place that they all cared about, but for different reasons. And they also agreed that they would stay at the table until they came up with an acceptable solution. They agreed that this was, or they could see from the very beginning that this would have to be a compromise. It wouldn't work if one group tried to enforce their opinion on everybody else. So they sat down with some skilled facilitators and worked at this for 10 years. It took them 10 years to hammer out a solution, but they finally came up with a compromise that they all agreed to. They took it to government. Government put this into law, and everybody still agreed with it. They still stayed with it. And the management strategy that they came up with provided some benefits, some secure benefits to each of the groups, and none of the groups got everything that they wanted. But this sort of a framework for a solution then was implemented in other parts of New Zealand. So this was a place where sense of place at a relatively large scale of a substantially sized region with many different kinds of people, sense of place motivated them to get together, come up with a solution, and that has provided a solution that's been useful to people throughout New Zealand. So I think sense of place can be really powerful, but it's tough to do it. Another thing about stewardship is we'll never get everybody to be on the same page about what's the best way forward. So I think it's important to identify key stakeholder groups, each of which have their own particular sets of concerns. Some of the groups that I think are particularly important are students, because they have the passion for the future. It's their world that we're talking about when we talk about change. Communities of faith, which are used to the concept of stewardship, and it's a very important part of how they think about, how they relate to their world and their God. Communities of faith are very strong in the United States. Local people I think, are another important community that need to be part of this. This involves individuals, it involves businesses, it involves practitioners and agency people. I think there's several groups of people that can make a big difference in how sense of place plays out and have strong feelings about sense of place. So even if we can't get everybody on the same page, there's important conversations that can play out with each of these. And I think as we engage any particular group of stakeholders, the most important thing to do is to listen and think about and learn from them what they know about their place, why they care about their place, what their vision is for the future of their place. I never would have guessed about the future of those communities in Alaska, or those visions for the future of those communities in Alaska, if I hadn't gone there and just listened. So it's important to have dialogue rather than to come in and tell people what's happening. I think the scientific community has done ourselves a huge disservice by lecturing about climate change and all the bad things that are happening and how each one of you and us is causing these problems. I think it needs to be less problem-focused and more solution-focused. Climate change brings opportunities as well as problems. And if we can get on with the solutions rather than just getting mired down in the problems, I think we'll make more progress. One way that this dialogue has happened in Alaska is that a group of people was organized mainly by leaders from the faith community, also who brought in native leaders and science leaders to form a group called One People, One Earth that has workshops in different parts of the state. And the main message has been to advocate to reduce rates of climate change and to adapt in various ways to the inevitable consequences. But one of the things that's come out of it, for me personally, is that all of us have the same message. We may have come at it from different lines of evidence. We may come at it from different motivations, but all of us has the same message and we care about the same things. So I think there's real powerful opportunities for collaboration among groups that don't normally get together and do things together when you look for these opportunities. I think another way to think about this is to imagine a positive Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a term that geologists now use to characterize the current geologic epoch as being one where the impacts of human actions create a noticeable change in the geology and the process of our planet. People are doing things that have a planetary scale impact. And we think of this, I have usually thought of this in a negative way, but I think it's really important to think about the positive opportunities that come in Anthropocene. It's not that there aren't problems, but the glass is half full and we can fill it up more if we think innovatively about ways that we can manage the changes that are likely to come. But this is going to mean some very deep societal discussions. It's a discussion about sustainability, about stewardship. But what is it that we want to sustain? Sustaining it for whom? Is it just for the people that are in power? Or is it a broader segment of society? Who's going to do this sustaining? Who's going to make the decisions? To what extent can these be locally informed and locally driven rather than looking for a more aggregate top-down solution? But there's efficiencies in top-down solutions. So can we find ways in which bottom-up information, insights, and knowledge and wisdom can be linked to top-down opportunities and efficiency in order to come up with solutions that are broadly applicable but nuanced in a way that they're relevant to local concerns. I think there's all kinds of exciting science and citizenship and policy and action that can fit in there. So I think science is at the point where it needs to, where we as a society need to create a social movement to create and shape a more sustainable future. And science needs to be part of this, but it can't drive that process. I think those of us that are part of the scientific community need to be more action-oriented. And there's so many different ways to do that, that you can find, that each one of us can find a way that fits with our personality, our passion, and our skills. It can be through teaching. It can be through engaging with local communities. It can be through doing research that's community relevant, that's action relevant, that's sustainability relevant. There's so many different ways. I think we can look for ways to partner with other messengers rather than just by feeling that science has to carry the message completely. And so this brings up new opportunities for finding better ways to communicate, new partnerships for communication, and new partnerships for listening to concerns of other people. I think we need to engage leadership, but do it in a way that empowers people that are going to be affected by decisions that leaders make. We need to think of uncertainty not as a reason for inaction, but as an opportunity to experiment, to do things that make sense in particular places to particular people, but might be different than a solution that another community or agency or state might come up with. And so if we can have a bunch of different locally inspired solutions to a common set of problems, we're going to learn much faster than if we come up with a single solution and try to apply it everywhere. So through this kind of learning, I think we'll learn much more about how to develop strategies to manage risks. So, in conclusion, our planet is vulnerable to climate change, and Alaska illustrates those changes, but it's certainly not the same as changes that are happening elsewhere. But I suspect you could tell me, each of you could tell me a very similar story about some place that you care about. There's huge, important sources of resilience for dealing with the challenges that we face in a changing planet. There's opportunities for transformations to a very different way in which society interacts with nature. Some of those opportunities are going to play out badly, and some of those are going to play out much better. And we need to be very much aware of how our actions influence the places in which we live in order to understand how to learn from the good solutions in order to move forward and in new ways. I think sense of place and stewardship and empowerment provide important guidelines for action, but it has to play out differently in each place that's locally informed by people who know those places. And lastly, we can't wait for somebody else to do this job. This has to be our job. We can't wait for somebody else to solve this problem. We have to do it. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd appreciate those. Yes?
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I was wondering, as an ecologist and scientist, at what point was there a pivotal moment that made you become perhaps more interested in working with communities and translating some of that knowledge? And then my second question is, or related to that, is what strategies have you found successful in working in interdisciplinary groups? As an ecologist, how have you intellectually made that scholarly transition to?
I guess there have been several pivotal moments rather than one, and maybe I'll answer the second question as a bridge to the first. I've usually changed what I study because I realized that the things that I was studying were not the most important thing to answering the questions I wanted to answer. So I shifted from physiological ecology of individual plants to ecosystems because I realized that microbial processes were determining the amount of nutrients that were present, and that's determined what plants could take up rather than the physiological properties of plants. I shifted from ecosystem science to social ecological studies because I realized that the human impacts on the planet were really important and that they interacted with ecological processes. And I think important in each one of these shifts has been the fact that when I try to make each one of these shifts, I'm a beginner. I'm like a beginning graduate student. So I have to spend a lot of time listening to people around me who know more about this system that I want to learn about than by starting out with my knowledge and delivering that knowledge. So I have to spend a lot more time listening and then just thinking about how what I'm being told fits in with what I already know. And sometimes I realize I have some bad misconceptions and I can learn from that. Sometimes I think that something of what I know might be useful in this broader context. So in terms of working with communities, the immediate trigger for this was a talk that was given by a native leader who came to the University of Alaska and talked about how the research relationship between communities and the universities had been totally exploitative on the part of universities, that researchers went to communities to extract information and knowledge, to take it away with them and publish about it, and not with any goals of improving or even informing the communities of what they'd learned. And so he put his finger on our chest and said, you need to turn that relationship around. So this was our effort to try to do that. Yes?
Yeah, I do really agree with your talk. I don't want to break the optimistic energy that you're feeling. About climate change, I'm wondering if human society is more going into a faster, easier solution, and I'm thinking about geoengineering. So I don't know in the US, but at least in Europe, we clearly see emerging like some labs doing more and more engineering research, like putting some iron in the ocean, particles in the atmosphere. So we all agree that's probably not a good solution because we have too much uncertainty. But I'm wondering how confident are you in the future, knowing that our society usually goes to the faster, easier solution than plenty of small solutions.
We will collectively make some really bad mistakes and do some really foolish things. But the climate engineering is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
I was part of a discussion group of ecologists and social scientists talking about this, and and climate scientists as well. And through our discussions, we came to the conclusion that the real key issues is not the engineering of climate management, but it's the governance of climate management.
Yeah.
It seemed that the situations in which people would be most likely to act for climate solutions would be the solutions that would most benefit them would be that they would be most able to take politically and economically would be least likely to benefit them. And the solutions that might benefit climate more broadly didn't have a governance structure that would make it feasible to implement those. So it seemed to me that the learning that needs to happen is about the governance structure, learning more about scenarios of the geographic distribution of climate changes that would be implemented by any engineering approach, and the duration of those changes, and the likelihood that you'd be able to maintain those changes, because you could put aerosols in the air, cool the planet, and allow CO2 to continue to rise. But any time that society couldn't agree on continuing to control those aerosols, then climate change would just have a massive jump because of all of the additional CO2. So the long-term impact of that climate, of that geoengineering, was unlikely to play out effectively. And so if people know the governance issues that are associated with geoengineering, I think, and can do the climate modeling of how climate change would play out with different governance scenarios, I think you could lay out which of those are likely to produce plausibly good societal outcomes, and we couldn't find any. But so I think in cases like that where a narrow approach to a problem is uninformed by other pieces of the puzzle, I think those are the places that get dangerous. And so I think as a scientific community, we need to sort of be aware of those conversations that are going rapidly along a narrow track and broaden the conversation. Yes?
Given that the governance dilemma that you mentioned, what would be your, say, like dream vision as to how we would begin developing that policy? What policy, how would that policy look like?
I think it needs to be a whole suite of policies at different scales, international, national, statewide, and local. I think these policies need to be compatible with one another, so we need a much more effective polycentric pattern of governance where there's more effective communication across levels of governance, and where each level of governance has more responsibility and ability to act on those issues where they are best able to implement solutions. I don't think that's necessarily the case right now. So, for example, there's very poor governance at the international scale for issues of climate change. Changes in Arctic sea ice. There's things that can be done to change, to deal with the issue of an ice-free Arctic, but we don't have the governance structure to do that. So I think developing a polycentric system of governance that speaks across levels of organization, that speaks horizontally to learn from ways in which other people have done things better or worse than the way we're trying to do it, is going to be really important. But how we get from here to there, given the history of governance that we have in each different country, is a difficult challenge.
Yeah, turning from global, figuring out how to set up systems at the global scale down to, say, universities.
Mm-hmm.
The kinds of researches that you're talking about, I'm convinced the faculty want to do this kind of research. But the incentive structure within universities rewards, certain things. We always think, we're supposed to, create journal articles, get money, train graduate students, things like that. How do we reward the kinds of research that will make have important implications at the community levels?
I think if we can each start with ourselves. We'd like to do research that's important and that builds on our skills. So in order to do that, I think if you have some sort of a portfolio of research that is groundbreaking but high risk, you've got some great idea, but it's high risk, and you have other research that's safe, and you'll get publications, and it'll create an incremental addition to knowledge. Now, oftentimes, interdisciplinary research, a lot of the groundbreaking research that happens at interdisciplinary interfaces, where people get together and talk for the first time about issues of common interest, but where there hasn't been a history of research to develop knowledge. So that's a new opportunity to develop knowledge that I think each of us has, and has the mechanism of going out and finding people that would be interested in questions that we might be interested in. So that's a way in which individually we can motivate interdisciplinary research and research that has higher impact. And I think it's the responsibility of departments and deans and presidents of universities to recognize the opportunities that come with interdisciplinary. There's more faculty jobs available in interdisciplinary science now than there were 5 years ago. Every major university in the country is creating a new institute of the environment or a new institute of sustainability. It's the fad. And we have, as I told you earlier, we have a graduate program that we started in resilience and adaptation that links natural and social sciences. And all of the graduates of that program have said that this interdisciplinary training made it easier for them to get jobs rather than more difficult. So if the goal of the university is to create a set of alumni that can find jobs, I think that's a market that's open to universities that are innovative in that respect. I think if universities want to create opportunities for major research advances that are not just doing more of what's been done in the past, there's lots of interdisciplinary funding opportunities out there, but they're high risk, high gain. So it's one of these things where you have to develop the culture and the questions locally, I think, to be able to compete at those for those national interdisciplinary research awards. So that would be my strategy.
Do you think the goal of deaccelerating climate change, conserving the Earth's ecosystem and their species are mutually exclusive with increased economic growth? I'm not enough of an economist to be able to answer that question with knowledge. I can just answer with intuition. But I would think that any time that there's going to be a huge transformation of economic production, there's going to be huge opportunities for economic growth. But it's going to be different in different sectors than the traditional economy has been. So there's going to be a lot of adjustment that would be required. Think about the opportunities with renewable energy, with different transportation systems, different ways of 50% of the infrastructure in cities is going to be built within the next few decades. That's a huge opportunity to do it right. So I think there's ways in which we can do things much better than we have that have much less impact on the climate system. I suspect we'll continue to have an impact on the climate system. We won't be able to ratchet it down to zero, but I think we can have a lot less impact on the climate system than we have so far. Right now, we're on a trajectory of climate change that's this business as usual. It's indistinguishable from business as usual. We haven't had a significant impact in our efforts to reduce climate change, except maybe some indications in the last few years. But I think we can't afford not to try. Well, thank you very much, Terry.
Thank you.